The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee. He left Nazareth and went to live in Capharnaum by the sea, in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali, that what had been said through Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled. Land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, the way to the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who sit in darkness have seen a great light. On those dwelling in a land overshadowed by death, light has arisen. From that time on, Jesus began to preach and say, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." As he was walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew, casting a net into the sea. They were fishermen. He said to them, "Come after me, and I will make you fishers of men." At once they left their nets and followed him. He walked along from there and saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets. He called them, and immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him. He went around all of Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and curing every disease and illness among the people. The gospel of the Lord. How many of you have ever gone fishing? I'm not talking, okay, how many of you have gone deep sea fishing? Oh. I used to go fishing when I was a kid, but it was one of those types of fishing where there was a little pond in our neighborhood, and then later we moved and we lived on a lake, so it was a lake. But it was one of those things where you threw your net, your rod or your string into the lake and caught a bluegill, and you took it off the hook and threw it back. They call it catch and release or whatever it may be. I used to enjoy doing it, even though I never ate or kept any of the fish that I caught, just because it was so relaxing. It was a nice thing to do. I was a kid, I had plenty of time on my hands. Today we hear about Jesus calling his first followers, and they were fishermen, but they weren't the kind of fishermen that we think of. Even the deep sea fishermen, they weren't like that. They didn't have rods and reels. They fished by nets. Fishing by net means obviously you have this very heavy net that you throw into the sea, and then you try to drag it and drag all the fish that you can catch. It's not an easy job. In fact, we may not realize, but the fishermen of the gospel of 2,000 years ago were very strong men, and the job was a pretty good job. They probably made decent wages. Capharnaum was near a major trade route. So they would take their fish that they caught, they'd go up to the route, and people passing by, all kinds of caravans passing by, going to Egypt even, and different parts of the world, and they would sell their fish. And that's how they made their money. So it was kind of a prosperous living for that time. But Jesus went to the Sea of Galilee. He moved to Capharnaum, and if you've ever been there, there's a sign as you enter the ancient town of Capharnaum that says, "The home of Jesus." He wasn't born there, but that's where he spent most of his last 3 years. That's where he gathered his followers. The first followers, today's apostles, today's disciples, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew. 2 sets of brothers. And it tells us in the gospel that he called them. And immediately, it says, immediately, they left their boats, they left their nets. John and James left their father follow him. It doesn't mean that they never went back to fishing. In fact, we know as we continue to read the Gospels and as we read the Gospel of Matthew throughout this year, we'll have many times where they went back to fishing, where they had other things that they were doing. Following Jesus was certainly a full-time thing, but they also had to feed their families. They had to make that money so that they could, the families could live. I'm sure their wives would have not been very happy if they didn't bring home any more money, and how were they going to feed their children? So they had to continue, but Jesus called them. And this call has to remind us of the call that all of us have received to follow Jesus as well. It was not as clear as their call. You didn't hear necessarily. You didn't hear Jesus saying, hey, you, follow me. Come, follow me. God calls us in many ways, and he calls us a lot of times to follow him. We're following him, we come to church, we say our prayers, we do whatever, but God calls us to do many things many times. He may be calling you tomorrow to help out the neighbor down the street, or the kid in your class that's not getting good grades and needs little help, or whatever it may be. And next month he might be calling you to do something totally different. And the following month to do something even totally different. God calls us to do things many, many times. The call of God in our lives is not a one and done thing. And all of it is to follow him. But it's to follow him in many different ways. And what the future holds and how that call is going to be lived out, we don't know yet. But God also, as he calls us to do something, he calls us from something. He called the apostles in today's gospel from their fishing boats and fishing nets. They didn't give that up forever. They had to continue, as I said, to feed their families. They had to continue to work. But he called them from something. And God calls us from something as well. He calls us from our pettiness. He calls us from our lack of respect. He calls us from our attitudes towards other people. He calls us from not understanding, not forgiving the people in our lives that we still haven't gotten around to, or that we don't want to forgive. He calls us from that pettiness, from those attitudes, to get over that. So as we remember the call of Jesus in our lives, and sometimes we can't put a finger on it. I mean, not all of you are called to be priests or sisters or missionaries as I was. And I can't put a finger on the time I was called. It was kind of a thing that you just kind of grow into. Probably like a lot of you and your call to follow Jesus. I mean, if you were baptized as an infant, that's one thing, and your parents helped you with that call at the beginning of your life. If you were baptized as an adult, if you chose to follow Jesus as an adult, that's a whole other thing, and there's probably something that you can point to or that you can pick out and say, this is why. But it's just not one time. It's just not one thing. It's a continual thing that God continues to call us to follow him in many ways in our lives. In many things that we have to be called away from as well. We can follow Jesus better when we're willing to give up those things that we know we need to give up. And I can be honest in telling you, in the confessional, so many times, people confess the same sins that they've committed over and over and over. And it sounds familiar to all of us, because we're constantly struggling with that sinfulness. We're constantly struggling with whatever those things in our life are that God calls us to give up. God calls us to be away from. And we need to work on it, because that helps us then to listen even closer to what God is calling us to do and to be.